Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to our Trade Policy Research Forum webinar on gender mainstreaming in trade agreements. We're going to give it a few minutes before we start, just for people to come in through the Zoom lobby. Before I introduce everyone who's here, let me say hi to Hannah Norberg, my partner in crime and co-founder of TPRF. Nice to see you as always, Hannah.
Hey Ben, how are you?
Good.
It's nice to be here. Finally, that Thursday of the month.
That Thursday of the month, exactly.
Yeah.
So first bit of housekeeping. For those joining us, the webinar is being recorded. So please only stay if you are comfortable with being recorded. I'm going to say a couple of words about the forum before we actually get started with the webinar. So the Trade Policy Research Forum is something that Hannah and I started a little bit over a year ago now. The idea is to try and bridge the gaps that we see in the trade policy community. So our logo, if you've noticed, is a bridge. And, you know, one of the gaps that we want to bridge is between research and practice. So we like to bring researchers together with people who are working in international organizations, working in trade policy in different ways. That's one thing that we aim to do. Another gap that we aim to bridge is between people in different parts of the world. So a lot of trade policy research goes on in Europe and North America. Outside those areas, it can be hard to have access to top quality research. So we'd like to create a kind of brown bag lunch atmosphere for those around the world, particularly in low and middle income countries who are working on trade policy. And then the third gap that we want to bridge is between the different parts of the trade policy community itself. That is to say, trade policy is not just economists. Hannah and I both happen to be economists, but we work with political scientists, we work with lawyers, we work with public policy professionals, all these sorts of people. And so to be able to bring everyone together under one roof and talk through some of the issues, we think is a very productive way of trying to move forward. If you'd like to stay in touch with what we're doing, we do run a research webinar about once a month. The best way to stay up to date is to join our mailing list. You can do that by going to our website, which is tprforum.org. You can also join our LinkedIn group. So the LinkedIn group is now, I think, over 1,000 people. We post stuff there about the forum, but also it's a good place to post research, policy papers, these sorts of things. Job announcements sometimes get posted there. So if you're on LinkedIn, please do look for the group and apply for membership. If you have any trouble doing it, please feel free to reach out either to Hannah or myself, and we can make that happen for you. We're on Twitter, so please consider giving us a follow, TPR Forum, and we do hope that you'll stay in touch with us. So with that on the forum, and one more point from Hannah.
Yeah, so I was just going to jump in right here, just to set the tone sort of for the webinar. So Ben and I were super stoked about the TPR Forum and all the people who are joining us and all the amazing speakers that are here and who are taking their time out of their busy days to be here with us. But please do remember that although, we think it's an awesome forum and we have awesome speakers, it's just not going to be any better than the people who actually joined the forum. So please make sure that you jump in, that you use the Q&A box, that you keep your questions and comments going. We had a really awesome session like that last time because we happened to have a lot of practitioners who did anti-dumping. So that was super cool, for example. So don't be shy. So actually jump in here and comment and talk to us. That's the fastest way we can do it. So we have to use the little boxes, otherwise it gets too messy. So go ahead, Ben. I just wanted, and the webinar is recorded and the presentations also are going to be uploaded on the website. So take notes for yourself and that will be it. You can follow up later.
Exactly, perfect. So we'll hit you with a couple of messages in the chat so you can see where the box is and how to leave a message there. If you like using Q&A, please feel free to use the Q&A function. And with that, let me introduce our presenters. So the topic today is gender mainstreaming in trade agreements. What is already done and what remains undone. And we've got two great speakers. I think it's a fantastic policy area. It's one that I'm personally very interested in. Our first speaker is Professor Amrita Bahri, who's an associate professor of law at ETAM University. She's an international trade law scholar who's written extensively on trade and gender issues in a broad sense, and also very particularly both in terms of what trade agreements can do and also what potentially might happen in the WTO space. So I think she's got tremendous expertise in this area, and we're really looking forward to hearing from her. For discussion comments and also to present, I think, some of his own related work, we have Jose Antonio Monteiro from WTO. He's a research economist in the Economic Research and Statistics Division. He's been there since 2015. So, you know, he has a working paper, which I know he'll mention to you at the end of his presentation, looking at the role that gender plays in trade agreements. And so what we're hoping to get in part out of the discussion is, you know, the law on the one hand and the economics on the other. And then during the Q&A, hopefully we can get these two perspectives talking to each other. So very excited for the presentations. Amrita, let me hand over to you. The floor is yours.
So thank you so much, Ben, Hannah, for having us here. It's such a pleasure to be part of this webinar and talk about, discuss with all of you and hear your feedback and comments about the research on trade and gender policies. So without further ado, I would start with let me try and share. Okay, does it work? Can you see the presentation? Excellent, thanks, Anna. Right, so the question that I would like to address today is, can trade agreements accommodate gender equality? And to talk about that, we'll first look at the problem, then we'll see how the existing trade policies can solve the problem, and finally, we'll have a look at some hesitations WTO members face in accepting such initiatives. And I will focus more on the hesitations part this time. This is something I've been researching for the last few months, focusing on the hesitations and the barriers part. So this is something I would really appreciate taking your feedback and comments on. So let's take a look at the problem first. As we understand, we've had a lot of studies in the past few years on the barriers, various barriers that women face that impede women's access to markets and economic opportunities at the border, beyond the border, and within the borders. And the pandemic has not made it any better. It has just magnified the impact of all these barriers. Last year, I did a paper explaining how this has magnified the impact of women in trade. I've left a link for you here on the slide. So that brings me to my next question. So what can we do to help women overcome such barriers? We really have two options here, and one may not necessarily substitute the other. I think they can both complement each other. We can either employ a bottom-up or a top-down approach. So we either directly try to change the national laws, culture, social norms at the domestic level, or we use the international law to create an incentive to bring about these changes at the domestic level. In my research papers and my research work, I've tried to employ the second approach, which is a top-down approach, as I explore how we can make the trade policies work in this respect. Trade policies can work, and they can strengthen and empower women. For various reasons, but mainly for two different reasons, diplomatic and substantive. Trade policies or trade agreements can play a very important role in reducing gender inequality, because countries can encourage their trade partners to create laws and procedures that can reduce barriers and create encouraging conditions for women's participation in trade. So in other words, what we are actually trying to do is, or what I'm trying to say here is that it is possible to use the lure of market access to important markets for achieving this purpose. And it facilitates to the ease of negotiating with certain countries, which are pioneers of this approach. And in a way, for EU, for example, ever since EU adopted the Parliament adopted the resolution, the parliamentary resolution on gender mainstreaming in trade agreements in 2019, well, it has probably become a precondition to negotiate a trade agreement with EU to have understanding and expertise in this area. So for certain countries that want to gain access, market access to these economies, well, it's not just an incentive, but now a precondition. And the second reason is substantive, and I need not say anything about this. I think everyone who's here and part of this webinar is familiar with the studies on how gender equality has now become a business case, right? So yeah, trade agreements can help. And it is really interesting to see more and more countries in getting their hands into this trending approach of gender mainstreaming in trade agreements. The agreements with gender provisions are on a very steep rise now, and I think we've started to see a change, a dramatic change, mainly from 2015-16 onwards. And we understand that different countries have added provisions on gender in various ways. They have assumed commitment in various ways. The research at WTO Economic Research and Stats Division, led by Jose, has shown us how countries have added these provisions in different parts of the agreement, how they have drafted these provisions with a focus on different topic coverage areas, including agriculture, fisheries, social cooperation, and others. Now, what we understand is, and this is probably going to be the focus today of the presentation, some countries have really pioneered the inclusion of gender provisions in their agreements, right? And we have seen certain ambitious practices happening in these countries, but there are very few of them. Other countries, well, most of the countries so far have stayed far away from even discussions on trade and gender. And that's a fact we are facing. For various reasons. I think these hesitations include lack of data to show how they relate to each other. It includes general belief that trade policies are only for trade and not to solve social problems. Lack of political willingness. Fears that, and that's really important, as I have understood from the last few empirical interviews that I've conducted in several developing countries with trade negotiators, the fears that more developed countries can use these provisions in a protectionist way to reduce their comparative advantage or impose their own moral standards or their own moral values on other countries. And that can lead to moral imperialism concerns. What can be morally right for your country or in your country for the people in your country may not be morally right for mine. Let's look at the case of WTO to understand this concern. Now, the EC Seals case, right? I mean, you could argue that the decision that was delivered in the EC Seals could be seen as legitimizing moral imperialism that was inherent in the EU Seals regime. Mainly because the ban could be seen as an attempt by the EU to impose its own moral values onto a foreign jurisdiction, well, onto different foreign jurisdictions, without any consideration for their own moral values. So this imposition, in a sense, also went in a way against the traditions and cultural practices relating to seal hunting in Canada and Norway. By giving legitimacy to the animal welfare concern as a public moral concern, both WTO panel and the appellate body subordinated the moral concerns of the indigenous sealing communities in other countries to those of EU's animal welfare concerns. So this is a classic example that reflects how justifying a trade measure under a vaguely defined value. And that is important. I think that is probably going to be the next big development, a vaguely defined value such as public morality or gender equality may allow the responding country in a dispute to effectively define the moral concerns of the foreign jurisdictions. either to impose their own moral concerns or to destroy their comparative advantage in a particular product or in a particular industry. Another barrier could be the high cost and the low probability of compliance. And that's important. That's again important. It could be a fundamental barrier for certain countries. Countries' willingness and appetite for such inducements rely on their domestic conditions, as countries may not be willing to be a part of an agreement that contains promises and commitments they simply cannot comply with. So the countries with practices and policies that do not discourage gender inequality, or countries that do not comply with commonly accepted norms such as under the CEDAW or ILO conventions, might be less likely to accept such provisions. And there might be counter arguments against this, against what I'm saying here, because I think the case of the story of African countries and their trade agreements completely go against what I'm saying right now. I mean, that for some reason presents an exception to this. Lack of data is another problem, especially for developing countries, because it becomes a huge burden for them to gather this kind of gender disaggregated data. And finally, a lack of understanding and expertise on trade and gender issues. I mean, several countries have tried to overcome that. For example, the European Commission now has a huge understanding and expertise on these areas, and they're further striving for expanding this. Canada, Chile has its own division on inclusive trade and inclusive commerce with these brilliant trade negotiators working only on focusing on trade and gender issues. Canada as well, but most of the countries do not have this expertise. So basic questions remain as to what is gender responsiveness? So how can we make these trade agreements gender responsive? Why should we make these trade? What amounts to gender responsiveness in trade agreements? So to overcome this barrier, in particular, International Trade Center prepared a methodology to measure the gender responsiveness of trade agreements. This is basically a maturity framework which can help policymakers measure gender responsiveness of agreements they're negotiating or looking to renegotiate or modernize. And what did we find after we applied this methodology to the existing trade agreements? Well, after reviewing some 400 plus trade agreements and measuring their gender responsiveness using this framework, this is what we have found, right? This map gives you a fair idea of countries that include gender commitments in their trade agreements and those that don't. I would say three specific things to note here. First, the regions that have signed the most gender responsive agreements are probably North America and East Africa. In fact, East Africa has signed some of the most responsive agreements with binding legal commitments. And that completely goes against the theory of cost compliance and probability of compliance that we were discussing a while ago, right? So how do we make sense of that? Number two, EU follows the trail, but it still has a long way to go in terms of gender mainstreaming because it has not front-loaded but back-loaded most of its gender provisions in the trade and sustainable development chapters and provisions and so on and so forth. And number three, different regions have different ways of including these commitments. Here you can see how Canada seeks to use its agreements to enhance women's access to education, finance, business opportunities, productive resources. EU is using its agreements to enhance women's access to health services, reducing violence against women and protect women's lives. And they have loaded most of their gender commitments not in the trade pillar of their association agreements or integration agreements, but in the non-trade pillars, in the social cooperation or political dialogue pillars of their agreements. So the other question is, can we consider them gender commitments or gender equality commitments in the context of trade policy? And that's a question for us to discuss. So gender mainstreaming is quite diverse and it changes from one region to the other, but there are three things in common, right? Three things in common. Most of these commitments are best endeavor promises. So they cannot be enforced. They are left outside the scope of the agreement's dispute settlement. Most agreements do not most parties that negotiate these commitments, they don't identify the institutional procedure. There are some exceptions, but most of them have not identified procedures or institutions to implement them. It's changing gradually, but I think it needs to be made more robust, the implementation part. And finally, finance. I think finance is a very fuel to this engine. I mean, 95%, 98% of these agreements have included all kinds of Cinderella promises without parties trying to identify how they go about mobilizing the resources for these promises. So yeah, I guess 3 questions I would like to conclude with are these. So many agreements, new agreements. Look at USMCA, such highly enforceable labor commitments. We can say all sort of same things, fears of cultural imperialism, protectionism, everything we said about gender equality, about labor. But hey, we have USMCA and other agreements with enforceable labor commitments. If that can be negotiated, how about enforceable gender equality provisions? Number 2, as we understand, almost all trade agreements have incorporated GATT Article 20 or exceptions on public morality, or to protect animal health or life, conservation of exhaustible natural resources. Can we talk about negotiating an exception to reduce inequality? Or can we possibly try to invoke Article 20A, arguing that protection of women's economic interest amounts to protection of public morality? There are arguments for and against. And finally, without enforcement, implementation, and finance, don't you think these provisions would always remain Cinderella provisions and be never put to action, especially for countries who are getting into these agreements merely to gain access, market access to important countries that have obligated or preconditioned the inclusion of these cooperation best endeavor promises to sign the agreement, pretty much, right? I'll probably stop here, and I really look forward to feedback. This is this has not happened before, but I'll be honest and I'll say it out loud. Usually I've been more excited about what I'm presenting, but today I'm more than that. I'm more excited about being hosted by Hannah and Ben and hearing their comments and feedback. So this is a different experience for me, and I'm really excited to hear your feedback.
Well, thanks so much, Amrita. That was a really great presentation, and you stuck perfectly to time too. So, you're already pretty much my favorite person at this stage. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion as well. Let's open it up by giving the floor to Jose Antonio, who's going to both act as discussant and also present a little bit of his work, which I think you already referenced, by the way. So it's a nice lead in that we've already got there. So Jose Antonio, floor is yours.
Thanks Ben, and thank you, Amrita, for the interesting presentation. So the question of today's webinar is, can trade agreement accommodate gender equality? And spoiler alert, I think the answer is yes, but in the end, it depends on what the level of ambition you want to achieve to accommodate gender equality. And Ben mentioned in the introduction that I wrote a working paper, actually several working papers on gender provision in trade agreements. And yes, just before mentioning that whatever I'm saying, nothing can be held against me. These are my personal opinion and do not represent the views of WTO and WTO members. But more seriously, yes, I worked a little bit on gender provision in trade agreements in the context of joint publication of the WTO and the World Bank on women and trade that we published last year. I was one of the coordinators, and I looked at how trade agreements address explicitly the gender dimension in women. And what is important, I think, before going into details about how provisions, trade agreements address gender issues, is to recognize, and it was mentioned briefly by Amrita, that trade agreements, they do provide opportunities for women to improve their economic condition and social conditions. In the report, for instance, we show that based on survey data for a large number of developing countries, we show that women tend to work more in companies, firms that export. We also find that women tend to earn higher wage if they work in a firm that exports or that imports, compared to working in a company that is not involved in international trade. And another important issue, is, in particular for developing countries, is the issue of informality. And we show that women who are engaged in trade directly or by working in global value chain, they tend to leave the informality sector and get a formal job. So we know that trade offers opportunities to improve women's economic empowerment. The issue, and it was actually mentioned by Amrita at the beginning of her presentation, is that women still face a large number of barriers, and those barriers, they shape the benefits that women get from trade. And as Amrita said, there are a number of a broad range of barriers that prevent gender equality from being a reality, including still in a number of developed economies. And so you have discrimination, traditions, law that discriminate women against men, and in some cases also bureaucracy. And of course, you also have tariff and non-tariff barriers that can discriminate women because it's important to acknowledge, or at least to highlight once again, that trade and trade policy are not gender neutral. They have different impacts on women and men. And so from a, I'm not a lawyer, I'm an economist. And so from an economic point of view and looking at trade, is what can trade and trade policy can do to address some of these issues. And of course, you can say, okay, we are looking at trade policy, so we should focus on tariff and non-tariff barriers. And it's indeed important because, for instance, the report that we published last year, it shows that there is a so-called pink tariff. Women face higher tariff than men, whether it's in terms of the goods that they produce, they are subject to, and that they want to export, are subject to higher tariff than the sectors in which men work more. And also in terms of consumption, women tend to import and consume goods that are subject to higher tariff. And so addressing tariff and non-tariff barrier to, support women's economic empowerment is important from a trade perspective. However, and I think it was in a way implicit in what Amrita was discussing, is that tariff and non-tariff barriers and trade policy in general is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of how you can promote gender equality and support women's economic empowerment. So you can, of course, to address those barriers, increase market access for women by, for instance, eliminating the pink tariff, streamlining, improving, or harmonizing non-tariff barriers, improving access to trade finance, for instance, or trade facilitation, which we know can have a huge impact on women's traders. But this is just actually the tip of the iceberg. You cannot, at least that's my view, you cannot ensure gender equality just through this type of trade policy. Because you need first to ensure that, okay, you improve market access for women, but you need to ensure that women have the capacity to actually engage in trade. And so you need to address all those barriers that are often domestic issues, not specific to trade. And so it's access to education, access to finance, access to information, and so those are different types of policies that are not usually what we would consider as trade policy. And the other important aspect is making sure that the risk from trade, because we know that trade, by opening trade, you have some sectors that will expand, but some other sectors that will contract because of import competition. Some workers might be negatively affected, and including women. And in fact, we know that in some cases, women are more exposed than men. And so you need to have in places, it's usually, if you want to make sure that women benefit the most from trade opportunities, you need to ensure that all the risks associated with opening to trade are addressed. And this is usually done through labor policies and ensuring the labor market is efficient, and the transition adjustment costs are as low as possible. And so these are the way, in a way, to address the barriers that women face to improve their economic empowerment. And if you look at the trend in recent years from a number of countries to gender mainstream their policies, not just trade policies, but also public policies in general, you see that they address, in a way, the two issues behind the iceberg, behind the top of the iceberg. You have to address to mitigate the risk from trade. You have some countries that have put in place gender impact assessment of the trade policies to identify the sectors where women will be mostly affected, the sectors where women will benefit. Of course, to do this type of exercise, you need gender disaggregated data. And the other approach is, of course, looking at trade policy and trade agreement, is whether to include or not gender provision in trade agreement. And in Amrita's presentation, I think some of the focus was on what we called explicit gender provisions. So provisions that really mention explicitly women and that address gender issues. And so these are what actually I looked at in my work, but I also actually looked at other types of provision in trade agreements, what I refer as implicit gender provisions, such as provision on labor, because you can have agreements with labor provision that address discrimination in the labor market, and without mentioning, women's discrimination, but it's still highly relevant. And you also have agreements that include provision on human rights, and we know that gender equality is one aspect of human rights. And so you have different approaches, and I focused mostly on what we call in the WTO regional trade agreements, free trade agreements, reciprocal trade agreements. And the distinction is important from unilateral agreements because the approach to address gender issue is slightly different. In unilateral trading, preferential trading schemes, a number of countries, such as the European Union and the United States, they have in place schemes that require developing countries to adopt a number of international conventions, including on human rights and labor, and in order to get lower tariff and better market access. And so this type of unilateral programs, they have a conditionality on market access. But if you look at the other bilateral and reciprocal trade agreements, there's no such explicit conditionality on market access and adopting and complying with international agreements, including those that relates to gender equality. And so in my work, I looked at mostly those reciprocal trade agreements, And if you look at all the trade agreements signed over the years, you see that the inclusion of gender provision, explicit gender provision, is not new, but it's still limited in comparison to other types of issue that relates to sustainable development, such as environment or labor, or even more recently, small and medium-sized enterprises. The other important thing is, and it was mentioned by Amrita, is that the scope of those provisions has changed a lot in recent years. And a lot of the discussion on gender provision actually really focuses on what we observe in recent agreements signed by a few countries, such as Canada, Chile, and recently the UK and Japan, where they have negotiated a standalone chapter on gender. But otherwise, you find gender provisions throughout agreements, on different places, and so there is no, there is no unique template. There is no common approaches to address gender provision in trade agreements. And so, what I did was to look at do a network analysis to see what are the patterns, what do we observe, and actually there is a lot of heterogeneity, and there are actually, if you really look at those ambitious labor provisions that are very detailed and addresses very, very different issues, it's really a recent phenomenon, and it's really specific to a few countries, mostly developed economies or emerging economies in North America with Canada, and in Latin America with Chile, and more recently the UK and Japan, but it's still much more limited than what you observe with Canada and Chile. And I won't go into details, but there are, yes, a broad range of types of gender provision, and most of the provisions on gender are about cooperation. And there was a comment by Georgina in the chat box before. It's an approach that has been chosen by those countries to really focus on cooperation. So if you compare it to other types of provision that relates to sustainable development, such as environment or labor, the approach, depending of course on the country, is different. Usually, if you look at labor and US agreements, the focus is more on enforcement and compliance. And so while in this case of gender provision, the focus is more on cooperation. And so, of course, then you can argue, are cooperation provision what lawyers call that best endeavor provisions? Are they do they achieve their objective? And then it can get philosophical if you want, whether you need really to have a stick, or whether the carrot is enough to make progress. And so I don't think there is an answer yet, at least based on data, to that question. But what we know, based on the mapping I did, what you know is that the most detailed provision on gender, you typically find them in countries that are share a relatively similar level of economic development, and countries that have relatively already high level of gender equality, or very small difference in terms of gender equality. So it's countries that are already on the same page in terms of gender equality that tend to include gender provision in trade agreements. Just to conclude, because I know I'm running out of time, and I apologize for that, I think what is really missing, and it was also part of the message of Amrita, is that we still really don't know to what extent those gender provision, explicit gender provision, are effective. Do they have an impact or not? And this is in part due to the fact that they are very recent. So in some cases, they have not even been implemented because the agreement has not been enforced yet. But it's also because there is a lack of gender disaggregated data. And to do this type of, in order to determine the efficient, whether the provision has achieved its objective, you need gender disaggregated data. So the collection of gender disaggregated data is key to ensure we can actually test and analyze the efficiency of effectiveness of such provisions. If you are interested in what I just said, the book of the joint report is available for free, and I remain available now for the discussion. Thank you for your time.
Okay, thanks so much, Jose Antonio. I think that's a great set of, like we said, kind of mixing comments and also introducing your own work. And, you know, I think even between the two presentations, we've got a really great sense of sort of the different perspectives that that lawyers and economists bring to this question. And I think that's one thing that we'll probably get into a little bit in the Q&A. So let me kind of, you know, take a few things. So what I'm going to do is mix some of the questions that are in the chat with some of my own questions, and we'll try and get through as many as possible. Amrita, maybe I can turn the first question to you. This is really building off what Jose Antonio had in his last slide. So, you know, I'm a data guy, he's a data guy. You know, when you look at trade and gender, you think, how do I formulate provisions, principles, rules, when in most of the world, and indeed for some types of data, it's the whole world, we don't have what we need to know what women consume, what we know a little bit more about what they produce, the way that they engage with formal and informal sector, this sort of thing. But, you know, so one perspective is, you know, that we would put our first energy into building data. So things like women, business and the law and she trades and these other sort of data initiatives. Then the other perspective that came from Caroline in the chat box is that actually putting the provisions in the agreements gives people an incentive to go out and collect the data. How do you see that kind of playing out? Because, you know, I'm conscious in what you said that, you know, we are seeing more and more of these provisions, but, you know, you raised the issue of kind of both enforceability and I think also tracking performance. You know, how do we know whether these things are working or not? So, you know, how do you see this interplay taking place between kind of, you know, rules on the one hand and kind of data and analysis on the other hand?
No, thank you, Ben, for this very interesting question. And yeah, I think this is really $1 million question, right? We are all struggling to answer at the moment. A really quick response to the first question about not having data, not having evidence to understand whether they work together or whether these kind of provisions in trade agreements are having an impact, a positive impact on women in these respective jurisdictions is a huge constraint. But I think the quick response to that is, and that's probably not an educated response, but more of an instinctive response. What is there to lose, right? I think we are including gender commitments in trade policy instruments as an experiment. Clearly as an experiment. We are treating trade agreements as a labs to experiment where inclusion of gender provisions may not have any negative impact or may not have any harm as such on countries, on economies, on social conditions, even on trade, because none of these gender provisions are being added as binding provisions. So they cannot even be used as a protectionist weapon, as we saw in, I don't know, maybe the US steel and aluminum tariffs and possibly the argument of protectionism under the garb of national security exception. That's not happening in this case. So there is no harm. It is a completely harmless experiment that we are conducting to see whether gender mainstreaming in trade agreements can be beneficial for women in trade, whether they can protect women's economic interest in these countries in the future. As we go ahead with time, of course, with the brilliant researchers and international organization researchers, with what Jose is doing and other organizations are doing, we are bound to have more data. We are bound to have more evidence in the years to come, not in the decades, but in the years to come when this is trending. So I think we are really focused on collecting more data. But that drive has to happen from international organizations and from developed countries. It's not going to happen from developing countries for various reasons. One, because they may not have the political willingness and readiness to gather this data. Two, because they may not have the right resources to invest in their think tanks and research centers that could help them or facilitate gathering this data. And three, this data basically comes from the private stakeholders, from the companies, from the industries. And when we look at the industry structure and organization of industries in developing countries, they're quite fragmented. We don't have an organized private stakeholdership. You talk about fisheries. In developing countries, we don't have organized fisheries industries. So it is very difficult to gather gender disaggregated data from unorganized industries and economic sectors. How do you equate that, or how do you put that in the equation of the arguments on binding commitments? I think I completely agree with what Georgina said in the chat. She made a very pertinent point. She said, well, these cooperation provisions, non-binding provisions are great to start. There is great starting board because we don't have the evidence, we don't have the understanding. Countries feel more confident on starting their experiment with these cooperation spirit-based provisions because they are learning and they're building their understanding on this aspect using these promises. And I think this is a great starting point. But the problem we are witnessing right now is that even though this is a great starting point, most of these commitments are not being implemented. So either we need to come up with implementation mechanism, or we need to think about enforcement to really make the implementation aspect binding on the countries. We need to come up with one or the other, and that at the moment is difficult for various constraints we have mentioned, of course.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point that you've raised there, and it sort of leads me to the next question, which I know we're focusing on trade agreements here, but WTO is kind of also part of the discussion. And I take your point, and I think you're absolutely right that this is an experiment, and in a certain sense, the cost of running the experiment is very low, right? Because we include these provisions and we see what happens. We're not creating trade barriers, we're not changing market decisions, all this sort of thing. So I think that's all very fair. But I'm just wondering about the politics at the WTO. In the chat, and I think also in your presentation, to a lesser extent, there was reference to USMCA and the labour provisions. And to me, both as an American and also as an economist, it was striking because, among economists, USMCA is often sort of seen as a bit of a step back relative to NAFTA. But there is obviously this other point of view from the labour movement where it was a step forward. But of course, the politics are very particular because you have this particular relationship that I know you have some expertise on between the United States and Mexico. What happens when we generalize that in the context of the WTO, where we have, obviously a majority of countries that are not high income, and I think we've already seen to some extent with labour and environmental standards that there's a real allergy to talking about it. Even in the sort of experimental sense that you're talking about. So how do we try and do better on gender in a WTO context? What sort of ideas do you have on that?
Thanks, Ben. I would probably say that we at the WTO front, we're already doing a brilliant job at the moment. If you compare WTO's position and initiatives from what we were witnessing 10 years ago. I mean, we know that WTO was an organization, not just seen and considered, but was an organization that probably did not believe in trade and gender being in the same sentence together. And now we see this organization that has evolved into a symbol of trade and gender movement and advocacy in the world. So many initiatives. We have incredible research by Jose's division. We have the gender focal point led by Anush. We have the informal working group, which has prepared this declaration, which is definitely an advancement over the declaration we saw in 2017. Of course, even this declaration that would be tabled in a few days at MC12, it doesn't contain any as such binding commitments, as we say, but there are concrete proposals and concrete actions to be taken. So I think a lot is already happening. The informal working group on trade and gender is led by several countries, and still we have certain other countries like India that have not joined the group, but they have started to show interest because of all these activities happening at the WTO. I was so surprised. I've been trying to send several emails and get in touch with the trade negotiators. I worked at the Ministry of Commerce when I was doing my bachelor's of law in Delhi. And so I know a couple of people there, and I was trying to get in touch with them to offer them a workshop on trade and gender. And I never received any response, but 2 weeks ago, we had the first ever workshop with the trade negotiators in India because they have now opened their ears and they want to know more about it. They want to understand. And that's plainly a response to what is happening at the international fora. So I would say that a lot of positive developments have happened, and we need to take a moment, step back, and appreciate and applaud these efforts at the WTO and other organizations.
That's good advice. I think you're right to highlight the movement that's taken place in a very short period of time. That's really spot on, and I think it hits kind of a key issue about what the dynamic is in this area. Hannah, let me throw to you. Did you have something you wanted to put into the mix?
Always. You know how it is. And I see that we're running out of time. So I'm just going to post it very quickly. I have one question for each of you. So Amrita, you hit on something that I always think is so interesting when we are diving into an issue and then it becomes hot and everybody's talking about it and everyone's like, oh yeah, I know what that is. Then it turns out there is no definition. So everyone is, describing the color blue, right? And so my question is, as you've been going through all of these agreements, is there, sort of a point where you can say, because the definition needs to be made, right? Otherwise you can't have the rubber meet the road. So do you have any ideas of what would be, maybe not a great finished product, but a good start, or who did that well? Is that Chile? Are they leading in that too? So that's my one question for you. And for San Antonio, this is my question. So I was, I'm a rubber meets the road, a sort of data person. So my question there is, so we need more data, right? And of course, this is a gender issue, and it's a human rights issue, and it's a morality issue. No question about it. But it's also great economics. I mean, if you get half of the population in, you're winning, right? You will have economic growth. So my question is, if you could pick, if you had a magic wand and you could say, this is the sort of data that I would like to have, what would you have? And is there something that you would like to have because you realize that this will drive the conversation forward or the knowledge forward? And is there something that you would have that would be able to take it out of that, where people can say, it's a soft issue, or it's just, blah, 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 but it's actually gets into hard economics? Thank you.
Sorry, I'll just really quickly respond to Anna's wonderful question. Yes, exactly. Right? We have as per Jose's estimate, more than 20%, something around that, trade agreements already have at least one gender explicit provision. And frankly speaking, and Jose, please correct me if I'm wrong here, none of these agreements define gender equality or even gender. I think gender can have different connotations for that instance, right? I mean, it's not just about men and women. It could be about sexual orientation. It could be about other things. So it is really important that we start thinking about it. And that probably could be the next big step. And I know that we have trade negotiators from Canada and some other countries listening to us. So maybe they're already planning it, because when we look at what wonderful work Georgina and others are doing in Canada and Chile and EU, I mean, they're already one step ahead of us, what we're talking about. So I'm sure it's already on the cards, but we need to have a definition. And that's one strong resistance that's coming from some developing countries, several Middle Eastern countries and South Asian countries. They're talking about how they can even enter into a commitment without understanding what the definition of that concept is. But on the other hand, and I'm an advocate and I would always present a counter argument, and the counter argument is, public morality doesn't have any definition, and the appellate body has recognized this several times that, well, it's a concept that, you know, it needs to be defined by each country and in the context of time and conditions and countries' own values. So again, the question is, do we really need a definition? But then, because of the lack of definition of gender equality being added in these trade agreements, it is becoming a huge fear. It is becoming a huge fear for developing countries that they can face trade restrictions and trade embargoes because they're not looking at these commitments as provisions that can give them opportunity to enhance their gender equality situation, but as provisions that can be used as protectionist tool by developed countries. So there's a lot of skepticism on that front.
Yes, not just what about the issue of definition. Actually, there is only, in the mapping I did, there is only one agreement. The East African community would define gender, but otherwise there's no definition as you know, in the agreement that mention or explain what gender refers to. But the question on data, yes, it's important. I guess, I mean, from you know, I mean, of course, it depends on the perspective, but as a trade economist, and when you look at especially if you look at women's economic empowerment, what you need is data on the labor market, and data is aggregated by gender. And often the issue is that, I mean, I'm going to get technical here, but the issue is that gender disaggregated labor data uses a different classification. So it's typically by occupation, and what you want as a trade economist is by industry, by sector. And so for the joint report on with the WTO and the World Bank, we did release a database on labor disaggregated data by industry for a large number of countries, mostly developing countries. And it's a first step. What you would like to have really is panel data, is data over time, data disaggregated by individual, not aggregated. So this is the type of data. Sometimes it exists, but it's not. It's available, but you know, there is no consistency. So you cannot use the data available for one country and merge it with the data of another country. So I think, especially if you want to look at the aspect of women's economic empowerment, labor data, gender disaggregated labor data is key. But just, I mean, to conclude, I think really me, and this is my personal opinion, I think, as was mentioned by Amrita, I mean, it's RTAs, trade agreements, regional trade agreements are a laboratory. So it's about really devising new types of provision, and you can see the evolution. Actually, if you look at those agreements with the standalone chapter on gender, you see the evolution, and it's just like 5 years. In the span of 5 years, you see how it has changed. For instance, if you look at more recent agreements, they have devised institutional mechanisms to try to monitor. I mean, the objective is to monitor the compliance of the provision on gender. So you know, it's always evolving. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a great note, actually. I mean, I'm conscious that we're just hitting time. So I know there are other great questions there in the chat. I'm afraid we're not going to get to them today. But to wrap up on that point of kind of the laboratory idea, seems to me a really important one. So, you know, one thing that we do here at the forum is report on research, but I think this is one case where we're saying to researchers, okay, keep your eye on this. And, you know, it might be that as data gets a bit better in the future, we can actually do some really rigorous sort of assessments to see what, not just sort of the big picture stuff, so inclusion or non-inclusion of gender issues in trade agreements, but particular types of provisions. What can we say about what they do for the reality of women's economic lives on the ground, both as producers and consumers? So I think that, you know, as a data guy, again, my prejudice is always towards that sort of work. But I think we've hit on an important way in which that can only happen if we get this stuff into the agreements in the first place. And, you know, I really do take, I think, Amrita's point that the types of provisions that are going in are not creating a great risk for the trading system in the way that some of the previous discussions over things like labour and the environment would have led you to believe. So these really are sort of quite different provisions. So look, we've really gotten a ton of information and ideas for that from that session. Let me thank both of our presenters, Amrita and Jose Antonio. I think your two presentations went together really, really well. There was great sort of communication between them. So I really appreciate the work that went into that. And I know that the audience as well really appreciated all of the new information and the new ideas that you were able to put forth. So really sincere thanks for being with us today. Let me just wrap up with a quick advertisement for our next webinar. So we do this, as I said, about once a month. Our next webinar and the last for 2021 is on December 16th, as always at 9 a.m. Eastern time in the US. And we'll be having Javier Lopez-Gonzalez from OECD to talk about 3D printing and international trade. So it should be a fun session. He's got a new working paper on exactly that I think has some results that are both surprising in the policy world, but I think also sit well with some other results that we've seen out of the World Bank and elsewhere on 3D printing. So, you know, the question that we're going to be asking is, you know, is this really kind of revolutionizing the global trading system? Is it going to fundamentally reorient trade flows, in particular from developing countries, low and middle income countries, or is something different going on? And so Javier is going to have, I think, some really interesting answers to that. You'll all receive an email from Zoom in a day's time that will have a link both to sign up for this webinar and also to sign up for our mailing list and stay in touch with us. So again, thanks to our presenters. Thanks, Hannah. And thanks also to everyone who's attended and for all the great questions that went into chat. And we hope to see as many of you as possible on December 16th.
Thank you so much, everyone. And for next time, Ben, we really have to work on that time machine because an hour is way too short and nobody has more than an hour. So we need to somehow compress time. Thank you so much for everyone for coming and for jumping on with all the questions and comments with San Antonio and Amrita. Thank you. Amrita, you are available on LinkedIn, right? So in case someone has more comments and questions for your paper, is it okay that they reach out there?
Absolutely, by all means. We have some brilliant comments and questions in the chat box, and I've copied and pasted all of them for my notes and future research. So thank you so much for them. But please shoot your questions.
Excellent. And then for those of you who have just not gotten enough of gender and trade right here today and want to talk about WTO, I just posted a link, Trade Express, which is the organization that I also work with, where I'm the president of actually. We are hosting an event tomorrow based on paper that we did on 10 great ideas that the WTO could work on. And we, it's on the website and it's in the chat box. And so thank you everyone, and we'll see you soon. And again, also one more thing before you go, in case there are questions that issues that you would like us to talk about here in the forum, or if you have some people that you would like to, have on the panel here, let us know, and Ben and I will do our very best to reach out to them. I am shameless in asking for favors, so I will call anyone at any time to ask it if they would talk to us. So if there's someone that you're too shy to ask, or if you're just interested in it, let us know.
Absolutely.
So thank you, everyone.
Fantastic. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Have a good day. Bye.